Let's get finally to the 65-inch version of the AF9 from Sony. And yes, this is the 65-inch version, because people have told me in my previous 65-inch TV review that something doesn't look right. This looks too small. But well, I can just tell you this. I bought this low, but specifically a little bit wider than any 65-inch TV, so they fit. This one barely fits, so this is a 65-inch. Even though I also have to tell you this. I can't give you a general recommendation if you should buy it or not this time, just because of the big price difference in different regions. Because for example in Europe or in Germany on IFA, this was announced in the 65-inch version at the price of 4,000 euros. And soon after that, and I'm not quite sure when exactly and why it happened, but it dropped down to 3,000, which significantly bumped up its value. Unfortunately though, this never happened in the US, because I've checked Best Buy, I've checked Amazon, and I've checked the official Sony site, and it's still $4,500. And there I just have to say that compared to the A1 or the slightly redesigned AF8, I can't really give it a recommendation, because the price difference for those who cost about 3,000 euros compared to dollars compared to $5,400, this is just too much of a stretch. And even though this is better than the previous ones, it's not good enough to make up for that. But talking already about those four, at least in my opinion, the one that I want to highlight, four differences or improvements over the previous ones, which would be from least important to most important from my standpoint: the Acoustic Surface Plus, then the improved X1 Ultimate over the X1 Extreme chipsets, then also increased brightness and faster navigation. And the thing is just that I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to list them real quick so we get into the next thing, which is the design. And here I have pretty much two pros and two cons. About the pro side, I have to say it looks slick, it's thin, and it's actually still built very good with pretty much all the important ports that you might want to need. But on the con side, when it comes to the design, as nice as it looks, this is not a flawless design, and I'm not the biggest fan of it just due to the leaned back design. Because I mean, that's something that you can get used to over time, even though it still always looks like the screen is just falling over. But this comes also with trade-offs. Like for example, due to the way it stands here on this low board, there is a slight bend actually on the display. Such a small one that it doesn't really matter. But as you can also see, you can't really use a sound bar on that one. But both of these things, fortunately enough, can be avoided if you just mount it to the wall. So that's my solution. The next thing to be mentioned would be the remote control. I still have to say it's a little bit sad that they generally get neglected, because at the premium price level for a TV, I would wish for a premium TV remote that is just a little bit more ergonomical and has backlight. That's not the case here, but at least the buttons are in a proper layout and they have their own distinctive shape, so you can still find everything pretty much quite easy in the night, in the dark, even though it's not perfect. Let's already get to the first thing that I've mentioned, which is an improvement that I don't really care so much about, because it was on the lowest priority of my list, which is Acoustic Surface Plus. And in case you don't know what it is, they have actuation motors behind the glass that makes the glass vibrate and then, yeah, acts as a speaker. And that works well. And in general, this is actually a better TV speaker, but at the end of the day, it's still a TV speaker. And for me, the only viable option, for example, out of the box would be something what, for example, LG does on their premium TVs, like for example, that the ones they come with a sound bar. So that's why I'm not just recommending you, but begging you, if you get a TV of this caliber, you don't just want a brilliant picture, you also want a kind of matching sound. So at least buy a decent soundbar, if not a stereo system, or maybe even better, a surround sound system. And talking already about that, the AF9 now has the feature that you can implement the speaker here of the TV to a surround system as a center. But I'm gonna already tell you now, you shouldn't really do that, because just because it's inferior sound compared to any, let's say, halfway decent speaker system, it won't really match the sound, it won't be harmonically inside it. So I would still say actually rather don't use a center instead of using this one, or just get a dedicated center and then you put it below or above it. That's all I can say about that. Now the next thing that I want to get into is software and menus. We get now Android 8 out of the box, and this is something that is quite familiar to many people, I guess, because it still is Android, and even though it doesn't maybe look quite like on a phone, it's still pretty intuitive and you get a lot of options and settings and you can customize things a lot. But for me, the most important part, and actually one thing that I would have had expected to be such a big thing before I used it, but what I immediately knew to appreciate is the faster speed now, because apps launch very quick. the menus and navigation, everything works so fluid, pretty much instantaneously, and way better than it did before. Because back then, and we saw some lags and stutter, and for example, so many people are right now at the moment praise the Xiaomi Mi Box S. This one is way smoother, way more lag free, and just generally way better. So this actually makes a quite big difference. And then, for example, this time we have Dolby Vision out of the box. That was a little bit of a controversy last time. It's working now. And we also have a Netflix calibrated mode, and pretty much to just cover that already, I have to say I'm not the biggest fan of it, because as you will see in my sample here, it might look a little bit more natural and realistic, at least that's what many people say, and it's supposed to actually display exactly how that Netflix content is supposed to be. But as you can see, I think pictures or the video in general just get too dull, too dark, and for me actually dynamic range is missing, so I'm not the biggest fan of that. When it comes to the scaling now, many people always ask me about that. Well, I guess we don't really have to talk about the quality of 4K because it looks brilliant. There is no scaling needed, so absolutely perfect in that regard, and it looks really stunning. 1080p, I would say pretty much the same for, especially if you use already Netflix 1080p or high quality 1080p, this still looks absolutely brilliant on that. And even though there is a difference, obviously compared to 4K, 1080p is still highly enjoyable on this one, which maybe can't be said generally for 720p and lower, because for example, if you have high quality 720p, it might still be quite nice to watch because the scaling works pretty good. But let's just not forget, 720p is noticeably lower than 1080p or 4K. And especially if you have lower quality 720p or even 480p, it just isn't as great to look at it anymore. But obviously that's due to the lower resolution, something that's just a thing, and we can't really change physics in that regard. So that's that about. So let's get actually into the base qualities of the TV, starting off with the brightness. It got, and that's where I'm not quite so sure what I should call it. It definitely got noticeably better compared to the A1. But I don't know if it's quite significant enough to be called significant, because it got noticeably brighter. Definitely something I knew to appreciate on certain HDR content, but I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that, because SDR content didn't really need it already, because it was already bright enough on SDR content with the A1. This now has some reserves for HDR, but why I don't think that's maybe that important, I'll get into later. Also then the whites, I just have to say that the white is very uniform, it looks very clean, and especially there is some slight degradation towards the edges, but it's very subtle and it's not like a big jump, and it's so minor that I wouldn't call this an issue, because you don't usually look at plain white screens all the time. That's something you usually, if at all, do it with blacks. And with blacks, I have to say they are obviously, due to OLED, pretty much perfect, but people are maybe being concerned about black crush, especially if you use, for example, Dolby Vision Dark compared to bright or anything else. You notice that some details will just get crushed a little bit because things just get way too hard. So you really have to kind of find the sweet spot in terms of settings, because if you don't set it right, if you want it the best possible blacks, then in some situations you might lose some details. But generally I would say if things are done right, the slight black rush isn't an issue, and you will still get most of the details way better than on anything else, because OLED after all. Colors, I have to say these are super natural and realistic, especially if I compare them with the pics that I shot with some smartphones where I know how things should look, and then compare it here. Everything looks very natural, very pleasing, and even though this display obviously can make colors also pop and be super vibrant, for me the most important thing is actually to have natural and accurate looking colors, which is what you get along with the sharpness here. Because all I can say here in that regard is that it's absolutely brilliant. Everything is sharp, everything is detailed, and even though some people might tell you in reviews that you should tune down the brightness completely to 0, add a sharpness, I think that's still bogus, because nothing here looks artificially over sharpened, and there are no double crunches. Things just look sharper and they look more detailed, and as long as you don't get too far with those settings, you're absolutely fine. When it comes to the color temperature, I would say the first two ones, like cold and neutral, generally are a little bit too cold for me and a little bit too bluish. Otherwise, in case you liked it, obviously use it. My recommendations would be to use either warm or maybe even the expert setting, which then I personally found to be almost a little bit too yellowy, even though it seems very, very correct after a while. That's more of a setting that you have to get used to, but either warm or expert work really great. And now motion flow. That's the one thing that I still can't really get behind it. I'm gonna say It works pretty nice on 30K, on 30 frames per second content, especially for racing. There I found it to work really good because things get smoother. But then again, for example, if I watch soccer, that is in 30 frames per second, and I use motion flow, you still have some minor issues, as like the ball, for example, that gets kind of like twice or 3 times visible in certain situations. I mean, it gets more fluid, and the motion flow here works pretty much better than ever before because it's very consistent. At least there are no kind of slowdowns and kind of speed changes here, which is good. It's very consistent, but still not the biggest fan of it because, yeah, what else would you really need it for? Because if you have, for example, 60 frames per second content like the football game that you can see here, there it's just not needed anymore. And if you use it for a movie, sorry, then you're just a monster. That's just not supposed to be a thing. Other than that, the viewing angles, I have to say, are absolutely top-notch, because especially if you have a non-moving picture and look at it from no matter what angle, it still looks like it's absolutely printed on. It loses a little bit of brightness, which is absolutely normal and pretty much non-existent at all either. But colors maintain exactly as they should, and that's really great. And the last thing that should be mentioned definitely when it comes to an OLED are its weaknesses, because we still have burn-in and we still have the black cross that I've already talked about, and then we have just a little bit of brightness degradation over time. These are just things that are there. It's just due to the technique and it can't be changed. How bad it is, we can't really say. But for example, I have a colleague that had the A1 for about half a year and he already has seen some slight burn-ins. So that's just normal. Now let's talk about SDR and HDR. And here I just have to tell you that I still don't get the hype. I still am not wowed by it. And obviously someone in the comments told me I shouldn't judge based on Netflix HDR. And I mean, I've seen some other samples and so on and so forth. But the thing is, just for me, the good thing about SDR is that the TV then looks very bright. Everything is pretty bright. And I mean, you don't have quite the dynamic range, but everything just looks a little bit more uplifting to me. The problem with HDR for me is that it's cool to have super darks and super bright passages, but the way I see it, you have these few moments that can show you the spectacular stuff, but usually most content is in between, and that one actually then in most situations for some reason doesn't look bright enough and looks a little bit actually more boring and kind of almost depressive because it looks so dull to me. And this is just something that I personally can't get over. So the stuff in between, yeah, that's just the thing. Because, for example, especially if you look at all these demos, those demos are made to impress. They are made to be shown the extreme bright and dark passages. But this is not what normal real content looks like. That's just the thing. Usually you have more stuff in between. And then I'm personally not that hyped by it. So even though this TV can do both. It can look super bright, can look super dark, it can look super vivid to impress, but it can also look super natural. So it can do both. And I mean, I get that, but at the end of the day, I don't really need it. Now let's go to gaming. As you can already see here, I'm going to keep this short because it's not that big of a factor for me, and I don't think for so many people either, because motion blur, I don't see this to be an issue already for a long time already. Input delay, well, you can see it by the sample. I think it's absolutely fine, especially if you use a wireless mouse like I did, for example, or any gaming controller. So I would say this is great for console gaming. And let's just not forget one fact. Competitive gamers won't use 4K to game, and they won't do it on a TV. So that's why I'm just gonna say it as it is. This is not meant for competitive gaming, but this is meant for impressive gaming. And this, it does so well. Which actually already leads me to the main pros and cons, but you can see them listed maybe here on the screen. So let's quickly cover them very fast. This is the one big point that I did not expect to make such a difference, because it's so much nicer if you can navigate the whole system without any sluggishness. So that's great. We have great controls and we have Android 8 along with a stunning 4K and 1080p picture. And even though the scaling is good, 720p obviously won't pretty much wow anyone. Increased brightness, which is a nice thing to have, obviously, especially for those few moments in HDR, which though have to be mastered also the correct way. If that's not a thing, it actually looks worse to me. And then we have the typical OLED strengths, like for example the viewing angles and the amazing black levels. And one thing that I would add, but in brackets, because that's a thing for Europe and Germany, is the price. Because at around 3,000, and I've actually seen it as low as 2,500 euros, the price for what you get here as a complete package is pretty fair. Now on the downside we have the lean back design, which I'm not really a fan of, which you can obviously avoid by just mounting it to the wall, so then that's not actually really a con. And the typical obvious OLED issues, like I said already, burn-in, just a thing, degradation over time in brightness is just a thing, and the black rush, that isn't really an issue for me. And then in this case for the US in brackets, there is the price of $4,500 at the moment, which just makes me not being able to recommend it, because the price difference compared to the AF8 or A1, which are inferior to this one, is just too big. But talking about inferior, those back then already were great. And for what did I say in the A1 review? I said I'm actually not even quite sure what they could improve on the successor. I said they could maybe make it faster, they could maybe make it brighter, but other than that, that's that. And well, what did they do here? They made it faster, they made it brighter, and some extra goodies. So that makes it pretty easy to recommend it. And even though I maybe won't sound as impressed or kind of blown away like I did on the A1, that's mostly due to the fact that that was my very first 4K HDR TV that I've reviewed. And therefore things just were so new. But now having used more, having used TVs longer for a period of time, after solely using projectors for years, yeah, I'm just a little bit more used to it. Doesn't change the fact that this is still a brilliant TV. Pretty much flawless once again, with a lot of highlights. So everything it does, like I said already last year, on pretty much the highest level possible. And what it doesn't do, like for example the lean back design, you can just cover up by mounting it on the wall. So that's where it ends. In Europe and Germany, pretty easy recommendation. In the US, not quite so much, because there we have at 3,000 the A1, the AF8, and a lot of other brands with good TVs. So unless the price falls down there at the moment, no. Okay, so that's the review. That's it. Okay, until next time. And let me actually know one thing. Maybe I forgot some extra details in some things, so let me know that so I can include those in the next review. And also pretty one wish, if you appreciate these reviews and if you like the TV reviews, because I have to just say they are so much more work than anything else, and that's why I don't do them too many. Leave a like so I know it's worth it and it's being appreciated, and I will make more. But other than that, I really hope it was fine. And sorry, I totally forgot that. Happy New Year.